Hi, I'm Alex McNeil. I'm a retired lawyer. I got interested in the Shakespeare Authorship Question about 30 years ago in 1992 after reading this book, The Mysterious William Shakespeare by Charlton Ogburn. Today's talk is an introduction to the Shakespeare Authorship Question. It should take 30 minutes or so. I've got a lot of ground to cover, so let's get started. As a matter of convention today, when I refer to the man from Stratford, I'm going to pronounce his name Shakespeare, with a short A and a short E. The business records of the time generally use a short A and a short E. Certainly, spelling was inconsistent in those days. Likewise, when I'm referring to the author Shakespeare, whoever he may have been, I'm going to pronounce that Shakespeare with a long A and a long E. But let's actually start this talk with Charles Dickens. How do we know that Dickens wrote Dickens? Well, his name is on the works. That's evidence, but it's not conclusive. However, we have corroborative evidence. Dickens's life experiences are reflected in the works. He openly took credit for having written the works, and no one has ever suggested that he was not the author. Can we say the same about William Shakspere of Stratford? How do we know? Well, his name, or a very similar name, is on the works, but there's a lack of corroborative evidence. His life is not consistent with that of the author. What we know of his life is not reflected in his works. He never took credit for having written anything, and suggestions that the name was some kind of pseudonym have been expressed since the name first appeared in print in 1593. Our theory is that Shakespeare of Stratford served as a frontman for someone whose real identity could not be divulged. What is the traditional biography of Shakespeare? The traditional biography is that he was born in Stratford-on-Avon in 1564, received an excellent education at the town grammar school, went to London sometime in the late 1580s where he became an actor, a shareholder in a theater, a poet, and a playwright. He got to know the Earl of Southampton, who became his patron. He bursts on the literary scene in 1593 as a mature, fully formed poet with no known prior poetic works. He was actively writing plays, acting and managing a theater from the late 1580s to about 1611. He retired around 1612, moved back home to Stratford, died there in 1616. Some years later, two fellow actors gathered up the manuscripts of his plays and had them all published in 1623. The Stratford Monument was erected to him that year. Conventional biography, if read correctly, reasons backward from the conclusion. The conclusion is, we know he wrote the works, we know when he lived, therefore he must have written the works during the time frame about 1590 to 1611, therefore this is the life he must have lived. Careful bios always use qualifiers like must have, no doubt, we can be sure, etc. But we can't be sure. What do we actually know about the traditional biography? Very little. What is the verified biography of William Shakespeare of Stratford? There's no doubt that such a person existed, but only 5 facts are known about the first half of his life. His baptism in 1564, 2 records about his marriage in 1582, the birth of his first daughter in 1583, and the birth of twins in 1585. He's in Stratford, married with 3 kids by the age of 21. His son died at age 11, but his 2 daughters would survive him. There's no evidence that he went to school. Records for the town grammar school don't exist for this time period. For the second half of his life, more is known. He's in London by the 1590s in connection with moneylending. He's also in Stratford with various business dealings, buying and selling property. He's cited for hoarding grain during a time of famine. He sues locals for small debts. And in London, the tax authorities can't find him on 2 occasions. By 1600, he's become wealthy. He bought the second largest house in Stratford. He was a shareholder in a London theater. As a member of a theatrical company, he's one of several people awarded cloth to wear in a parade for King James in 1605. In 1612, he gives a deposition in a London lawsuit concerning his former landlord's family dowry. He buys property in London in 1613. He makes his will in Stratford and dies there and is buried there in 1616. What do we not have evidence of? There's no evidence of education, as I said, because there are no records from the town grammar school. There's no letter from him, nor is there a reference to the existence of any such letter. Yet letters are common in the Shakespeare plays. If Shakespeare had business interests in Stratford while he was in London, we should expect to find evidence of correspondence. We know of only one letter that was ever written to him, and that was from a Stratford neighbor asking about a loan. There are only two contemporaneous records that anyone even spoke to him. One is from the Stratford town clerk about a property matter. The other is from his fellow boarders in connection with the landlord's dowry lawsuit. There's no reference in his 3-page detailed will to books, manuscripts, musical instruments, nor is there a bequest to the town school or any provision for the education of his 8-year-old granddaughter. No one in Stratford refers to him as a literary man. William Camden, in his 1605 book, Worthies of Stratford, doesn't mention him, but Camden refers to the writer Shakespeare in another work. No one dedicated a literary work to him, nor did he dedicate anything to a fellow writer, though this practice was common. The London literary scene was a fraternity. The writers all knew each other. He's not mentioned in either of the two most detailed records of theatrical performances of the time, though the titles of several Shakespeare plays are mentioned. His death in 1616 goes unnoticed in the literary world, at a time when fellow writers did write poems and elegies noting the death of one of their fellows. His two daughters, Susanna and Judith, who survived him, were illiterate. Yet Stephen Greenblatt, in his introduction to the Norton Shakespeare, says, quote, "It is striking how many of Shakespeare's women are shown reading." His son-in-law, John Hall, a physician, mentions treating, quote, "that excellent poet, Michael Drayton," but doesn't mention his father-in-law. Similarly, his daughters and his granddaughter, who survived until 1670, are not known to have even mentioned his name. There's no evidence that he ever met the Earl of Southampton, his supposed patron, and there's no evidence that he traveled abroad. Well, you might say this was 400 years ago. Records get lost. That's true. No doubt some records have been lost. But let's compare what we know about Shakespeare with what we know about some of his literary contemporaries. This is exactly what Diana Price did in her book, Shakespeare's Unorthodox Biography, about 20 years ago. She compared his biography to what is known of 24 literary contemporaries, using 10 criteria relating toward connecting them to a literary life, what we could call corroborative evidence of writing. You can see those 10 criteria here. Here's her scorecard. Ben Jonson scored a 10. He met all 10 of the criteria. Thomas Nash, 9, and so on. As you can see, the median score is a 6. John Webster scored below a 4. He wrote only about a dozen plays and a few poems. He scored a 3. Bringing up the rear is Shakespeare with 0. Recall, however, that Shakespeare was very active as a writer for a good 20 years. His career was longer, and his literary output was greater than most of these other 24 people, and much more effort has been spent in trying to flesh out his biography. You might ask, was Shakespeare of Stratford even literate? These are the only known signatures of Shakespeare. Many people may have illegible signatures, but people who are used to writing show consistency from one signature to another. This looks like the hand of somebody who was not used to wielding a pen. And there's some evidence that these signatures were not even made by him, but were made by clerks trying to resemble the hand of someone who couldn't write. Compare the signatures of other authors, which are quite easy to read even today: Munday, Chapman, Dekker, and Drayton. There are numerous contemporary references to the author Shakespeare, but they don't establish that the Stratford man was the author, just as a reference to the writer Mark Twain doesn't prove the existence of a real person named Mark Twain. It simply means that the name is out there. Indeed, several references to the author Shakespeare suggest that it's an illusion. One is to quote our English Terence. Terence was a Roman playwright widely believed to have been a frontman for members of the Roman aristocracy. Another says, "Shakespeare, we must be silent in thy praise." Why must we be silent? Another one by Thomas Vickers in 1624 mentions, quote, "that famous poet who takes his name from shaking and spear," close quote. Yet Vickers mentions others by their actual names in the same document. This is the only name that he uses a circumlocution for. Could someone like Shakespeare, a commoner from a country town, have somehow acquired all that he needed to write such a vast quantity of work? Yes, he could have, but not without leaving any evidence that he did so. If you now have reasonable doubt about the Stratford man's claim to authorship, the question is, who was the real Shakespeare? Doubts about the Stratford man were expressed at the time, as I said. They resurfaced in the second half of the 19th century, and among the skeptics were Walt Whitman and Mark Twain himself. Some specific alternative candidates were proposed as early as the 1850s. But in 1920, J. Thomas Looney, a British schoolteacher, took a Sherlock Holmes approach. He reasoned that the author cannot help showing himself in the works. From Looney's reading of Shakespeare, he prescribed 2 sets of 9 qualities: a man of recognized genius, apparently eccentric and mysterious, of intense sensibility, a man apart, unconventional, not adequately appreciated, of pronounced and known literary tastes, an enthusiast in the world of drama, a lyric poet of recognized talent, of superior education, classical, the habitual associate of educated people. Looney developed a second list of 9 criteria: a man of feudal connections, a member of the higher aristocracy connected with the Lancastrian supporters during the War of the Roses, an enthusiast for Italy, a follower of sport, especially falconry, a sport that was reserved for the nobility, a lover of music, loose and improvident in money matters, doubtful and somewhat conflicting in his attitude toward women, of probable Catholic leanings but touched with skepticism. Looney then reasoned that the true author had had works published before 1593, that he didn't spring forth suddenly as a mature poet with Venus and Adonis, a 1,200-line epic poem. In an anthology of Elizabethan-era poetry, he found a few poems with the same rhyme scheme as Venus and Adonis, one of which was by Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, a person that Looney was not familiar with. As he researched de Vere's biography, Looney found that it matched his 2 lists of 18 qualities. This is the book that he wrote in 1920 called Shakespeare Identified. This is a 2018 edition of that book. As another convention, I'm going to refer to de Vere and Oxford interchangeably. When I say de Vere, I mean the 17th Earl of Oxford and vice versa. The Oxford earldom was the oldest in England at the time. Here's a brief timeline. You can read these for yourself. I just want to highlight 3 items. He received first-class private tutoring starting at a very early age, probably age 4. His first tutor was Sir Thomas Smith, a very well-respected man of letters. De Vere was a favorite of the Queen for a time in the early 1570s. She was quite infatuated with him. I'm going to speak later about his 16-month trip to the continent in his mid-20s. And going to the bottom of the list, apparently impoverished by the mid-1580s, he was awarded a grant of £1,000 a year by the Queen in 1586, with no accounting to be made for it. This was an extraordinary gift from a cheap monarch. Only one other award of this size was given, and that was to Sir Francis Walsingham for his network of spies. It would be worth, say, $300,000 to $500,000 a year today, at a time when top officials might have earned up to £100 a year. Here's the second part of the timeline. Again, I want to highlight 3 things from this list. The 1590s were a relatively quiet decade for him. He was largely absent from the court. He seems to have semi-retired. He writes of his weariness at being a courtier. His health is deteriorating. When James becomes king in 1603 upon the death of Elizabeth, he orders Oxford's £1,000 grant to be continued. Oxford died June 24, 1604. No gravestone, no funeral, no place of burial is noted, and no will is known to exist. There are innumerable connections between Oxford's life and events in Shakespeare's works. The volume of parallels is far too great to be simply coincidence. I want to highlight just 3. First, All's Well That Ends Well. The play opens with Bertram, a young nobleman whose father has died and who becomes a royal ward. He's to be married against his will to Helena, who's beneath his social station. The sovereign fixes that problem by elevating Helena's family to the nobility before the wedding. The same thing happened to Edward de Vere. His father died when Edward was 12. Under English law, when a nobleman died, leaving underage male children, they became wards of the crown even if their mother was living. Wardships could be sold, but the most lucrative ones were kept by the crown. So young Edward de Vere went to live in the household of William Cecil, Elizabeth's long-serving and most trusted minister, who also ran the court of wards. Cecil House was noted for its large collection of books and its lavish gardens. Records of de Vere's daily academic calendar exist. As a ward, his estates were managed by others. This was the beginning of a lifetime of financial woe. In 1571, William Cecil arranged for the 21-year-old Edward de Vere to marry his daughter Anne, who was then 15. Shortly before the marriage, Cecil was elevated to the nobility as Lord Burleigh. It was not a happy marriage, at least for the first years. But note the parallels to the play. A royal ward, Edward de Vere, Bertram. He's to be married beneath his social station. The monarch fixes that problem by elevating the bride's family to the nobility. I mentioned Edward de Vere's trip to the continent. During his 16-month trip in his mid-20s, he visited France, Germany, Verona, Venice, Sicily, and Genoa. Almost all the Shakespeare comedies and some of the other plays are set on the continent, especially in Italy and France. 2 are set in Venice, Othello and the Merchant of Venice. Venice was the most exciting city in the world for the arts at that time. Shakespeare knows the city well. Oxford was in Venice at a time when relations with the city's Jewish community were tense. The Merchant of Venice plot turns on Antonio the merchant, being liable to Shylock on a bond for the sum of 3,000 ducats because his ships have supposedly been lost at sea. In 1578, Edward de Vere invested £3,000 in an expedition to find the Northwest Passage, and he lost it all. The organizer of that expedition was Michael Locke. 3,000 ducats, £3,000. Shylock, Locke. Now let's turn to Hamlet, which is considered by Oxfordians to be the most autobiographical play in many respects. The key characters. Polonius is widely recognized as a caricature of William Cecil. In the play, Ophelia is Polonius's daughter. She would parallel Anne Cecil, who was William Cecil's daughter. Ophelia has a troubled relationship with Hamlet, just as Oxford had a troubled relationship with Anne Cecil. Hamlet's best friend is Horatio in the play. One of Oxford's best friends was his cousin Horace Vere, who was nicknamed Horatio. Polonius's advice to his son Laertes, neither a borrower nor a lender be, etc., is almost identical to the advice that William Cecil wrote out for his son before he left for Paris. Yet that advice was not published until long after Hamlet had appeared in print. But someone who had lived in Cecil's household, like Edward de Vere, would probably have heard those precepts many times. The book that Hamlet is reading in one scene, where he says words, 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 has been identified by scholars as Cardanus' Comfort. Edward de Vere sponsored an English translation of that book in 1572. It's dedicated to him and includes a prefatory letter and poem by him. Some scholars see echoes of Beowulf in Hamlet. The only known copy of Beowulf at that time was a manuscript at Cecil House. Hamlet is beset by pirates on his voyage to England and is stripped of his clothes. The same thing happened to Edward de Vere on his return across the English Channel at the end of his trip. His boat was seized by pirates and he was stripped of his clothes. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, 2 minor characters in the play. In 1583, Oxford's brother-in-law was sent to Denmark on a diplomatic mission and spent several weeks there. On his return, he wrote letters not published about his trip, including going to a state dinner where the guests included a Mr. Rosencrantz and a Mr. Guildenstern. Shakespeare's sources. Looking at all the works, scholars have identified hundreds of direct sources used by Shakespeare. Books of fiction and nonfiction in English, French, Latin, and Italian, and probably Greek. Books and manuscripts. Many of them were in the library of his very first tutor, Sir Thomas Smith. Shakespeare's favorite source is Arthur Golding's 1567 translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses. Golding was Oxford's uncle and tutor, and Golding worked on that translation at Cecil House at the same time that teenage Oxford was also living there. Shakespeare knew of recent scientific theories, such as Copernicus's theory. Obviously, Shakespeare loved literature, read voraciously, and had ready access to books. However, no Shakespeare source material was published after 1604, the year of Oxford's death. Let's examine Oxford's connections to the literary world. At least 28 books were dedicated to him during his lifetime. He wrote poetry under his own name until about 1576. Some of that poetry may actually have been written during his teenage years. He sponsored a literary salon through most of the 1580s. He hired Anthony Munday and John Lilly as his personal secretaries, both of whom would become well-known literary figures. Lilly is thought by traditional scholars to be a big influence on Shakespeare, but it's really the other way around. Oxford sponsored an acting troupe, as had his father. He's referred to as a playwright, though no plays exist under his own name. I wonder where they might be. Continuing, in 1578, in a Latin oration given to him by Gabriel Harvey, Harvey urged him to abandon his literary efforts for something more suitable to a nobleman and addressed him as Vultus Tila Vibrat, which may be translated as Thy will shakes spears. In 1586, de Vere is recognized as a poet. Quote, "Many honorable and noble lords and gentlemen of Her Majesty's court are most excellent skillful, among whom the Earl of Oxford may challenge to himself the title of most excellent among the rest." Again, in 1589, a number of Her Majesty's servants, quote, "have written commendably well, as it would appear if their doings could be found out and made public with the rest, of which number is first that noble gentleman, Edward, Earl of Oxford." Let's examine Shakespeare's general themes. The traditional view is that he wrote for the public theater, that his motive was monetary. This is one fundamental difference between Stratfordians and Oxfordians. Oxfordians generally believe that the works were not originally written for the public theater, but for presentation at Elizabeth's court and at other private venues. Shakespeare's point of view is that of a nobleman. He knows kings, queens, ambassadors, and courtiers. In contrast, he doesn't depict common folk that intimately. They're usually two-dimensional stock characters, often inserted for comic relief, and often with stock names, such as Dogberry, Shallow, Tearsheet, etc. Looking at the entire canon, Shakespeare's overriding theme is the question of royal succession. All the history plays, the tragedies, and even some of the comedies deal with it. Who has the right to the throne? Does some candidate lack a quality necessary to be a good ruler? If this is so, then Shakespeare's intended audience was the queen herself and those closest to her. Most of the plays were written originally much earlier, in the 1570s and 80s, at a time when Elizabeth was marriageable and could possibly have had a child. There's much evidence for these early composition dates. Many Oxfordians think that the purpose of the £1,000 annual grant in 1586 was to enable de Vere to write new plays and revise his existing ones to help build English patriotism against threats from foreign powers, especially Spain. Oxford likely spent his last 15 to 18 years revising his works for this purpose and to get them ready for eventual publication. The differences between the quarto editions and the folio versions of many of his plays show evidence of revision. Even so, it was against the law to write or even speak about royal succession. This was a totalitarian society. If a commoner was writing about such sensitive material, it is impossible to understand why he was never arrested or even questioned about his doings, and why none of his work was ordered suppressed or burned. Shakespeare alone seems to have had a free pass to write about such things. Briefly, two other dominant themes are, one, the concealment of identity, or mistaken identity, and second, knowledge of the law. In a sentence, Shakespeare thinks like a lawyer. He doesn't flaunt his legal knowledge, he simply uses it. Edward de Vere had formal legal training. Let's circle back to Will Shakspere of Stratford. How does he become an author, or at least get his name on published works? In 1593, Venus and Adonis, a 1,200-line poem, is published. This is the first appearance of the writer Shakespeare. It's dedicated to the Earl of Southampton. He must be important to the author if he was the only person to whom Shakespeare dedicated anything. Who was he? He was Henry Wriothesley, the third Earl of Southampton. Born in 1573, he's a generation younger than Oxford. There are a lot of theories about the nature of their relationship, but for this talk, it's important to note that, like de Vere, young Southampton became a royal ward when his father died. He, too, grew up at Cecil House. In 1590, William Cecil tried to arrange a marriage between Southampton and Cecil's granddaughter, Elizabeth Vere, the oldest daughter of Oxford and his late wife, Anne Cecil. Southampton did not go through with this marriage. Oxford and Southampton certainly knew each other. There's no evidence that Shakespeare and Southampton knew each other. Back to publishing Venus and Adonis. What are de Vere's options for authorship? He can't use his own name. That's political disaster, and it's culturally unthinkable for a nobleman to be writing something for the public to purchase. Options 2 and 3, publish anonymously or use an obviously fake name, are almost as bad, as they still raise the question of who really wrote the work. The last option is really the only alternative. Use the name of a real person, a front man. The front man gets money and social stature. We know that Shakespeare got both, with a coat of arms given to his family in 1596, thereby moving up the social ladder, and enough money to buy a large house in Stratford in 1597. This arrangement also answers the question for the casual reader. Insiders already know what's what and who's who. It takes the works out of the world of the Queen and her court. We now have what we would call plausible deniability. And there's also someone who can deal with printers and theater companies if need be. This facilitates the dedication to the person whose advancement is being intended with Venus and Adonis, Southampton. Here is the dedication as it appeared in Venus and Adonis. I call your attention to a key phrase, the first heir of my invention. It's commonly thought to mean the first thing I've written, but we would suggest that what it refers to is the first thing written under my new name. The purpose of the publication is political. It's to promote Southampton's stature and assist him in gaining popular support and perhaps even power. In 1594, the second long poem is published, Lucrece, also dedicated from Shakespeare to Southampton. But now the epic poems stop, even though they're very popular, and Shakespeare never wrote another dedication. Also in 1594, quartos, individual editions of some Shakespeare plays, begin to appear, but they have no author's name on them. In 1598, quartos begin to appear with the name Shakespeare on them. It appears that the real author now has greater control over the product. They're better quality than the ones with no author's name on them. Let's jump ahead to 1623, the year of the publication of the first folio. It contains 36 plays, about half of which had not been published before. It does not contain Shakespeare's poems, just the plays. This is 7 years after Shakespeare's death and 19 years after Oxford's death. Why then? And why continue the cover-up? There are several possible reasons. First, it was a big project. It took time to acquire the rights to plays that had been published and to edit the manuscripts of those that hadn't. Second, political concerns. Puritanism was on the rise. There was the fear that if they weren't published, they might be lost or suppressed. Puritans despised secular public entertainment and wanted the theaters closed. In fact, the theaters were closed 20 years later for a period of 18 years. Third, important persons were still alive. Southampton and de Vere's children were living in 1623, and one other important person, Anne Shakespeare, Will Shakspere's widow, died that year. Finally, the folio is dedicated to two brothers, the Earl of Montgomery and the Earl of Pembroke. Montgomery was married to Susan Vere, Oxford's youngest daughter, and Pembroke had been engaged to another de Vere daughter. They no doubt financed this expensive project. Ben Jonson, who had supervised publications of his own collected works a few years earlier, was probably hired to edit, and certainly was hired to prepare the introductory letters and poems. They appear to make the case for the Stratford man, but they must be read very carefully. Everything is capable of at least two meanings. The people behind the first folio could have stated unequivocally that the man from Stratford was indeed the author, but they didn't. Is the portrait page telling us anything? Here's the famous Droeshout engraving. Note that there's no coat of arms. More tellingly, the center has two right eyes, the tunic shapes don't match each side, there's an extra button. It appears that the head is kind of a floating head, as if it's mounted on top of a spade. And more tellingly, there appears to be a mask. If you look very carefully, there's a black line that starts under the left earlobe. It's hard to see, but it's a dark, straight black line, suggesting that the face is a mask. Is the Stratford Monument telling us something? Here's the current version of the bust of gentle Will Shakspere holding a quill pen in one hand and a piece of paper in the other. What is he holding them on? It's not a writing surface. Here's what the monument looked like in 1636. No quill pen, no piece of paper, and the sitter is holding what appears to be a woolsack. What is the monument inscription telling us? I call it a monument to misdirection. I call your attention simply to one phrase. Read if thou canst, whom envious death hath placed within this monument. Well, if you can't read, that admonition is not going to help you. But if you can read, it's suggesting that you read it very, very carefully. In conclusion, why should we care? Because if you have the wrong person as Shakespeare, you have the wrong man, you have the wrong time, you have the wrong audience, and you have the wrong message. Thank you.